So let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Luke Byers. I'm the Agriculture and Natural Resources Agent for the River Valley Extension District. You guys probably know Macy. She's the 4-H and Youth Development Agent, and you probably know at least one of the 4-H program managers too. You probably don't know me. Oh, looks like we have someone else coming on. You probably don't know me unless you've seen me around at a fair or some other activity. But I'm the Agriculture and Natural Resources Agent. And so what I do is I basically help farmers and agricultural businesses out with information and opportunities and resources that they need to make their farms more profitable and create value for their communities. As a part of that job, I also have the privilege of putting on the crops and weeds identification contest at
I want to show me. Hmm?
I also put on the crops and weeds identification contest at the River Valley District Club Day, which is coming up next Saturday. I don't know if any of you guys have done the crops contest before, but I hope that your presence here indicates that you're interested, and we'd love to have you participate and get all your friends to be involved in it too. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump into it unless anyone has any questions before we start off. And so here's just a little bit about the Crops and Weeds ID contest. So there's two different question sets, one set for plants and one set for seeds. There's three divisions. The junior division is if you're of the 4-H age of 7 or 8. So that would be if you were 7 or 8 at the beginning of the year, that's your 4-H age for the year. In that division, there are 15 questions per set. That would be 15 questions on plant identification and 15 questions on seed identification. The next division is the intermediate division, which is the 4-H ages of 9 to 13. That has 35 questions per set, which consists of the 15 questions in the junior division plus 20 additional questions. And then lastly is the senior division, which is for 4-H ages 14 to 18. That's 50 questions per set. There's using the 15 junior division questions, the 20 intermediate division questions, and then 15 more questions after that. Each of the questions is multiple choice. There's 4 options, A, B, C, and D. And as you progress throughout the divisions, the question sets get more challenging. So the easier questions are going to be in the junior division, but as you go up to intermediate and senior, the questions get harder and harder. And some of those questions will involve in distinguishing characteristics of similar specimens. So for example, some people might look at wheat and rye and say that they're very similar, but someone in the intermediate and senior divisions might be required to identify the differences between them. So that's just a little bit about the contest. Does anyone have any questions so far before we get into some examples? There's your slide for you. So of those 4 responses, let me know what you think the answer is. So the 4 options that we have there are corn, soybeans, hard red winter wheat, and milo. Let me see if I can bring up that poll again now that I just had it a second ago. All right, we have 1 person that answered, 2 people answered. Can we get a third? Oh, all right. 75% participated. We're still waiting on 1 more. Well, that's all right. We'll go ahead and call it here. And you were all correct. You all answered corn, which that's exactly what that is. That's a pretty easy one. But we're going to go ahead and keep going. And some of these examples might be easy for you. Some of them may be not so much. So here's question number 2. This one should be another easy one for you. All right. Oh, perfect. We got all 4 of you. You guessed correctly, and it was soybean. Now we're going to go back and do another one. So, corn, soybean, hard red, winter wheat, or milo. This is another easy one. All right, we got 3 answers in. All right, perfect. 100% once again. So we got all those correct. Here's another one. Another easy one. Corn, soybeans, hard red, winter wheat, or milo. Which is it? Looks like we got 4 out of 5. Go ahead and call this one. And everyone that answered is absolutely correct. It is milo. And one more easy one for you. We don't grow this one around here, but it will be on the test next Saturday in some form or fashion. Is it corn, cotton, canola, or cheat? All right, we got 3 answers in. 4. That might be all we're getting for the time being. But that's absolutely right. That is cotton. You don't see that grown around here really. But like I said, it'll be on the test because we do grow cotton in Kansas in some areas. And as a result, it will be on the test at the state level. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the results of the quick examples that we had. And I'm just going to go in to a couple slides about how we can go about determining the ID of certain crops and weeds. Now, before I continue, does anyone else have any questions? We'll go ahead and get started. So what are we talking about whenever we're talking about the crops and weeds contest is, first thing, we got to distinguish between the two of them. So if these slides will allow me to. So let's look at things from the perspective of crops for a second. What do we mean whenever we say crops? And how do we know that we're looking at a crop? Well, typically we would think of something being quote unquote fruited. And basically that means that if it's a grain crop, there's going to be some sort of visible grain there. And so whenever we see a plant and we're not quite sure what it is, you can look and see, is there a visible grain there? That might be a good indication that it's a grain crop. It's not always true, but it's often a good indicator. The other thing is seed size. So I brought some examples of some various grain seeds that we grow in Kansas. If you can see all this, it might be a little glaring, but here's some examples. Here's hard red winter wheat, sorghum, rye. As you can see, the size of the grain is often also a good indicator of what kind of a plant it is, because the way that we breed for certain varieties of crops is to get them to have the largest grain size possible so that we can have the best yields. The other thing that is helpful in determining whether or not it's a crop or a weed is compare the seed in the seed sample to what it is in the plant sample. So if you have a good idea of what a plant is on the contest, just take a look at that seed and carry that mental image over to the seed side of the contest, and you might be able to figure out what seed it is. On the other hand, there's also hay crops. So these would be crops that don't necessarily have a large fruited seed or grain associated with them. But a lot of times they are grassy. So if you have some sort of grass hay associated in the contest, keep an eye out for that. But also there's legumes like alfalfa and clover, which aren't necessarily grasses, but they are hay crops. And the distinctive characteristics of legumes is that they are nitrogen fixing. And so oftentimes you may be able to see little nodules on the roots of those plants, and that can be a good giveaway, especially on crops like soybeans. So a little bit more about crops, a little more in depth. So there's kind of two main categories that I'd say to keep an eye out for whenever you're trying to identify them. There's grassy types, and we can break them down into different subcategories. For example, corn and milo, you guys did a terrific job with the examples and knowing exactly what our four main staple crops are in this part of the state. And you also got cotton 100% too. So no concerns there. A couple other things to keep an eye out for is whenever it comes to hay, smooth brome, big blue stem, buffalo grass. Those are just a couple of examples of specimens that might be in the contest. You can identify those as hay crops, at least narrow them down into a hay crop subcategory. If you look for whether or not that hay, if it's a grassy type of plant, then you might be able to narrow it down and say, okay, it might be some sort of crop, smooth brome, or any number one of those that's listed there. And so if it's hay and you know it's hay, then you might be able to group it down and narrow it down in that way. The other thing about hay is that it doesn't have the same pronouncement of seed that grain crops do. So while hay does have seeds, otherwise we wouldn't be able to grow it, they're not as predominant in the plant as in some of the grain crops like corn or soybeans or something like that. And that's mainly because they're not genetically bred for the seed. They're bred for the forage quality, whether it's for the quality or the quantity or what have you. And then something that's going to be very tricky to distinguish is the cereals. And what do I mean by that? I mean things like wheat, rye, barley, triticale, oats. The distinctions between these guys is going to be by seed color, seed length, and the way that the nodes are arranged on the plant. But we'll get into that a little bit more later. But as you might be able to see here, I don't know how well you're able to see, but you can see there, okay, we got oats on one hand and we got barley on the other. In a lot of ways, they look very similar. But it's important to be able to identify what the distinguishing characteristics are between them. Otherwise, you might end up selecting an answer of rye or oats whenever it's actually barley or wheat. So it's important to pay attention to that. On the other hand, there's also crops that have broad leaves, which a lot of times we refer to weeds like this as broadleaf weeds. But just for simplicity's sake, I've broken it down into a grassy crop side and more of a broadleaf crop side. So these would be a lot of our seed crops, like soybeans, sunflowers, safflowers, and pinto field beans. And so now we're getting down to where we can break down these larger categories of crops and weeds into smaller categories to help us get a better idea of what these plants and specimens might actually be. So if you're looking at a broadleaf plant, you might be thinking, well, I'm not sure if this is a crop or a weed. But if you see a seed on the broadleaf plant that you are familiar with, maybe it's a sunflower seed or a soybean seed, then you might be able to say, okay, I can narrow this down. It looks like a crop associated seed. And even though it's a broadleaf plant, it might be a crop. In the same way, legumes are technically broadleafed plants because they're not in the grasses family. And so these would be things like alfalfa and sweet clover and red clover, things that you might say, hey, I've seen that before. That's familiar to me. I've seen my dad grow it, or I've seen it on the side of the road. Um, that's something that to keep in mind whenever you're looking at some of these, because that can help you narrow it down. Um, so if you see a broadleaf plant that looks familiar, that it might be a crop, then make sure you're not selecting an answer that says it's a weed. And so that's just one thing to keep in mind. However, we're still in really broad categories here. So let's see if we can try to narrow things down a little bit further to help us out. So here's something I wanted to talk about whenever it comes to distinguishing the characteristics of different cereals. So it might be difficult to see here, but hopefully you can all see that there are different examples of cereals, and where this is at, where this part of the plant is where the main stem of the plant meets where it shoots out into its head. So what you can see here is that there are diagrams here that are showing the differences between cereals such as wheat, rye, barley, oats, and triticale. Now, why is that important? Well, if you're looking at a plant of one of these cereals and you're not sure which one it is, looking at these characteristics can be useful in helping to distinguish them. So with that, there are a couple of features of these plants that might be useful to point out. So the leaf sheath. So the leaf sheath, I'll go back one. If you can see here where my mouse is at, that's kind of like the blanket that wraps up the node of the plant that shoots up out into the head. And how it's textured and how it's structured is different from each one of them. But some of the more obvious distinctive characteristics are these things called auricles. So the auricles are these little lapel-looking things, almost like someone's putting on a suit and tie, and these would be their lapels. On a rye, for example, they're very, very small, and oats, non-existent. But on barley, they're smoothly textured and come down here to a point that crosses each other. And then here on wheat, they have these little hairs that come off of them. And so if you're having trouble distinguishing, so say, wheat from barley, you can take a look at the auricles and see whether or not it's wheat or barley based off the texture of the auricles. And the same with rye and oats and triticale and all the rest. The ligule might be a little more challenging to identify. And this is the part, it's kind of inside the leaf sheath. It's almost like a little extra sheath inside the leaf sheath. But it's important to keep an eye on too, because it's not all the same. As you can see here in oats, it comes down to a point B, whereas with triticale, it's more of a shallow convergence. And barley, like we said, the distinction of the auricles combined with the similar ligule as the oats can be a distinctive characteristic between the two of those, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, the leaf blade, which goes out to form the flag leaf, and so on and so forth. So the cereals, I bring this up as an example because they can be pretty challenging to distinguish one from another. So it's important to keep an eye on some of these close-up differences between them. And we'll have magnifying glasses on the day of the contest, so that can be of help if you need it. As it comes down to seeds in the cereals, here's 4 examples that I brought up that might be helpful whenever it comes to the seed side of things, because there's a plant side to this contest, like I mentioned before, and there's also a seed side. And so whenever you're looking at the seeds, you might not be able to immediately see what the difference is between the plants because you only have the seeds to look at. However, if you are proficient in diagnosing the differences between wheat and oat and rye and barley on the plant side, and then you're able to see what those look like on the plant, then you can go over to the seeds and kind of help yourself out in that way. However, there are a couple things to point out. So for one, hard red winter wheat is the predominant wheat that we grow here in Kansas. There are some other types of wheat that are grown, but usually it's hard red winter wheat, and that's going to be the one that shows up on the contest. Something to keep in mind with that is it's hard red winter wheat. Now, does that mean it's exactly red? No, it doesn't mean it's exactly red, but we have to think about that in comparison to something like hard white wheat. Now, if there's white wheat and there's red wheat, would we consider this wheat seed here to be a white wheat or a red wheat? I would think of it to be more of a red wheat, even though it's kind of more of a burnt orangish brown. Because if we compare that to some of these others like oats, and rye, and barley, it's got a darker complexion to it. And so because we have that comparison between white and red, we can probably safely say that this one is wheat, especially if the option we have before us is hard red winter wheat. Oats can be a little tricky sometimes, but one thing that you should keep in mind is that oats that grow off the plant don't necessarily look like oats that are in your oatmeal because those are rolled oats. The oats in your oatmeal are rolled out flat. These are basically if you took an oat from your oatmeal and rolled it up like a burrito, and so that it's got more of a round elliptical shape to it. And then barley over here, what you can see about rye and barley is that they're not quite the same size as the oats. And so these are important things that you can use to help distinguish between these four cereals in particular. Now, moving on to weeds, but before I go on to weeds and different ways that we can break down identifying weeds, are there any questions about crops? All right, we'll go ahead and keep on going. So weeds, kind of like crops in some respects, you can break down into kind of two broader categories to help you narrow down what the specimen in front of you might be. So we have grasses on the one hand and broadleaf weeds on the other. And identifying weeds can come down to something as simple as name clues. So if you have a grass in front of you, for example, and you're pretty sure it's a grass, and maybe some of the options are, oh, is it a soybean? Is it cotton? Is it canola? Is it some sort of brassica? Is it a mustard? Well, if you know it's a grass, then look at the names of the options. If you've got a grass in there and everything else you know isn't a grass, that can be an easy giveaway of what the answer is going to be on the test. The other thing is if you have context clues. So you might have something where you say, well, I'm not really sure what this weed specimen is, but I'm pretty sure it's a weed. And the other thing is it looks kind of like maybe it looks kind of like smooth brome grass. Well, that would be something we harvest as hay, but maybe it's a grassy weed like downy brome, or maybe it's green foxtail or yellow foxtail. These give context clues because one, they give away the color, and two, they give away what the plant is supposed to look like. So keep that in mind whenever you're looking at this, and make sure you look at all of your options because there's a good chance that you're not going to have to distinguish between a green foxtail and a yellow foxtail. But if you do, make sure you keep in mind the coloration, and I would do some homework beforehand to make sure that you know exactly what the differences are. Another side of it is you could have something like cheat. Now, what does cheat sound like? Well, it sounds kind of like wheat. Well, it's because it looks kind of like wheat. But the reason it's called cheat is because it's basically fake wheat. And how can you distinguish fake wheat from real wheat? Well, just like before, look at the seed. The plant that you're looking at doesn't have the same kind of a seed that a wheat seed would have. then you can, but it has all the other characteristics of wheat, or at least many of them, then you might be able to say, I know this is a weed because it doesn't have uh, any forage quality, and it doesn't have the same kind of grain that we would see in one of our grassy crops, then perhaps it's cheat. So that's something to keep in mind as well. On the other hand, we've got broadleaf weeds, and we can kind of look at different ways of breaking these down too. So there's a family of broadleaf weeds called Asteraceae, which, if you abbreviate that to aster, that's Latin for star, which many of you know, the Kansas State slogan, ad astra per aspera. That's how we can think about that. And so that's, whenever you think about that, you can think, okay, I see this plant here. It's got a flower that reminds me of a star. It looks kind of like a star because they belong to the daisy family. And, and that can be a good giveaway that you're looking at a broadleaf weed. So for example, bull thistles, Canada thistles, musk thistles, and the common dandelion, these are all part of the Asteraceae family, and they all have that flower that kind of resembles a star. And these are all weeds. In fact, in the case of the thistles, they're noxious weeds. And so that can help you narrow things down. And so if you have some options on your contest sheet where you have the specimen has a flower that kind of looks like a star, and you've got some options like a thistle, or you've got some, quack grass or some cash crop, then you can pretty quickly narrow it down to what it might be and what it might not be. And then the other thing is, if the options on your test have weed in the name, then you could be pretty sure that it's a broadleaf weed. And I say that to say that you can probably narrow it down specifically to a broadleaf weed because most of the time the grassy weeds don't have weed in the name. A lot of times these are just broadleaf weeds that have weed in the name. So if it says ragweed or bindweed or knapweed or smartweed, then it's pretty sure to be a broadleaf weed. So if you know you're looking at a broadleaf weed, you can kind of narrow down your options. And if one of those options shows up, whereas the others, for sure, don't fall into that category of being a broadleaf weed, then you can narrow things down and circle the right answer. And the other thing that you can take a look at in identifying is just the description of the word and lining it up with the plant. So if you see something that might have spikes or seems pointy or in some way, maybe it's a puncture vine or a prickly cider or a prickly lettuce or a common cocklebur. And a lot of times these common names that we give to plants are to reflect what they look like or what they feel like. The same way with velvet leaf. Well, how do you know what's velvet leaf? Well, the leaf feels like velvet. And so those are pretty good giveaways. Now, one caveat I should say is that this isn't going to be the end all be all of how you determine what's right and what's wrong for the answers on the crops and weeds contest. You might have to do a little bit more homework beforehand to make sure that you have all your T's crossed and your I's dotted. But these are kind of general rules of thumb to help you narrow down your options so you don't feel as lost going into the contest. So, like I said, what are some other things to look for? So whenever you have the specimen in front of you, take a look at the color, the stem shape and size, the size of the plant. There are some plants on the test that have the word giant in front of them. If it's a giant version of that plant, maybe that's what it is. So pay attention to things like that. The roots, like we mentioned before, soybeans, for example, often have little nodes on the roots, and that can be a good giveaway what it is because they're nitrogen fixing legumes. And furthermore, if there's some descriptor about the root in the name, like for example, red root pigweed, well, if it's got a red root, that might be a good indication that it's a red root pigweed, and so on and so forth. Texture, we mentioned velvet leaf, or the spiky feeling of the birds on the cocklebur or whatnot. And the flowers too. Like we mentioned with the flowers that kind of resemble stars, that can be a good indication that you're looking at some sort of noxious weed. But there's other things too, like leaf structure, leaf venation, leaf shape, and leaf margins. Now I'll talk a little bit more in depth about these because these can be kind of tricky. These different characteristics of leaves, they can be kind of tricky if you want to get down and narrow down uh, between certain similar specimens. So let's take a look at leaf structure a little bit. So I'll bring up 5 main leaf structures. Well, 2 main ones and a couple of subsidiary ones. One is a simple leaf structure, which would be like this here. This here is a simple leaf because it comes out from the bud and it's just one leaf. Whereas you can have compound leaves, and that's where you have a leaf that's coming out from the branch that has these little leaflets on it. So we could have an even pinnate. What does it mean to be pinnate? Well, it means that the leaf comes out like a pin. And then it's even because each leaflet is directly across from one another. And it comes to an end where there's no odd numbered one out at the point. The odd pinnate one, as you can see, has this odd leaflet out that comes out to a point. And a palmate leaf is kind of like the palm of your hand. It starts in the middle and then it goes out in all directions, almost like little fingers. And then a decompound leaf. Well, this would be basically a compound leaf within a compound leaf. That's whenever you have a leaf that comes out and has leaflets, and the leaflets have leaflets. So that can be something to pay attention to. Now, we're not going to go into all the details of every single specimen that might be on the test and what kind of leaf structure or margins it might have, but these are things that you can pay attention to in your own studies as you prepare for the contest. Another thing is leaf venation. So what is venation? Well, it's basically how are the veins structured? A lot of times you'll look at a leaf and you'll be able to see that there are little lines that go from the base of the leaf out to the tips. Why is that? Well, those are basically the veins. They're the passageways that the plant uses to carry nutrients and water out to the edges of the leaf so that it can continue to grow and photosynthesize. And there are different structures of how that works too. On the one hand, here you can see parallel venation. Why? Well, it seems like they follow parallel to the leaf. Here's the outer edge of the leaf, and here are all the veins that run parallel to it. The pinnate venation is kind of like the pinnate leaf structure, where it starts in the middle, where you have a pin that goes out to the point, and then you have all these little veins that come out from that center pin. And here we have an example of a palmate or reticulate leaf venation, where it's just like a palm of a hand and the leaf veins go out in all directions like fingers. Leaf shapes, I'm not going to cover all of these because they're quite a handful. But some of the things that you can be looking for are what are the distinctive shapes of the leaves for each of these plants that I'm looking up? So do I have a circle-shaped leaf or an egg-shaped leaf? Now I'm saying egg with respect to the base, which would be down here by the stem. A droplet, a water droplet shaped leaf, an oval shaped leaf, a pill shaped leaf. We got heart shaped leaves too. And we've even got leaves that are shaped just like straight lines. And this would be a lot of our grasses and sedges. So keep those in mind. Be on the lookout for what shape the leaf is and do some of your own studies to see what plants go with what leaf shapes. And the last thing I'll mention is leaf margins. So there's different and different ways that we can kind of look at leaf margins as too. And what I mean by leaf margins is basically what are the kind of the concave gaps in the leaf that give it its unique characteristics. So over here on the far right, we have an entire leaf, basically has no margins at all. Then we have a crenated leaf. I think of that as being somewhat crimped. That's what I think of when I think of crenated. So that there's little tiny divots all around the leaf, but they're smooth. Whereas a serrated leaf has sharp divots all around the leaf, kind of like a serrated knife. Then you have undulated which are these deeper, smooth margins. And lacerated, I think of lacerated as someone getting a cut. So it's kind of like someone took a knife and made deep cuts in this leaf and then parted, where you basically have differences, or I should say gaps, margins in the leaf that almost go all the way back to the center vein. So now that we've gone through some of the ways that you can be on the lookout for distinctive characteristics in crops and weeds, we're going to go ahead and test your knowledge a little further. And these questions are not going to be quite as easy as the first few. So I'm going to go ahead and come up here and shoot out the first one. So all of you should have gotten the poll. Now we'll take a look. Go ahead and look at your options there, and let's see what answers you guys come up with. So the options are Canada thistle, long spine sandbur, fall panicum, or wild onion. Oh, you guys are good. Yeah, you guys got 100%. That is a wild onion. I guess that one wasn't too hard, especially considering a lot of us know what wild onions look like. So let's go to the next one. So this one, the four options are sumac sorghum, rye, jointed goat grass, or eastern gamma grass. All right, we have one response, two, all right, we got three responses. Any more takers? All right, we got all four responses in. And here are the results. See, that one was a little tougher. We had three of you click jointed goat grass and one of you get eastern gamma grass. It was jointed goat grass. And here's one of the giveaways. Now, it's really close up, so it might be hard to see that this is a grass, but take a look at these joints here. They look like joints on your knee or on your elbow or something like that, places where there are hinge points. And so that can be a good giveaway that that's what that is. All right. Next one here. So your four options for this one are velvet leaf, Pennsylvania smartweed, smooth ground cherry, and rye. All right, we got two answers in. Three. All right, we need one more. Oh, looks like we got all of them. Okay, so the correct answer was velvet leaf. So how do we know that this is velvet leaf? Well, it's probably hard to see from this picture, but the leaf has a very velvety texture to it. And the other thing that you can keep in mind is that whenever you have some of those really on the nose descriptors of the words, you can probably bank on it being some sort of broadleaf weed. And in this case, that's exactly what we're looking at. Now, that one was a little tougher, and it would be a lot easier if we had the actual in-person specimen. So don't feel bad if you got that one incorrect. So next one here. All right. Your four options are barley, red root pigweed, cheat, and green foxtail. Go ahead and put in your answers. Right, we have one answer so far. 2, 3. Just need one more. All right. Hey, that was great. You guys got that one 100%. And how do we know that that one's barley and not the others? Well, just one simple fact. You can just look at the grain in there. It looks kind of like a grass crop, but we also see this grain in here. We see that none of the other options had any significant grain crop. So good job on that one. All right, here's the next one. Now this one would be in the seed category. You don't get to see the whole plant, you just get to see the seeds. So your options are pearl millet, Johnson grass, Bermuda grass, or smooth ground cherry. All right, we got 2 responses in. Oh, differences in opinion too. All right. Oh, wow. We're really divergent on our opinions here now. Just one more. And what do you know? Let's take a look at these results. So we had one person answer for each category, and the answer is pearl millet. Oops. All right, here's the next one. Let's see if we can get more uniformity here. Here are your 4 options. One more, just need one more. All right, hey, you guys got that one 100%. Well, taking a look at the seed, well, we can be pretty sure that it's not some sort of broadleaf weed just by looking at it. And it kind of follows into suit with some of the hay crops we've been talking about. Um, but that's that's one of the things that you have to do is isolate the different options here. Okay, next one. This one should be pretty easy. Yellow nutsedge, long spine sandbur, big blue stem, or oat. All right, you guys rock. Yes, that is yellow nutsedge. What's the big giveaway? It's yellow. But also keep in mind, take a look at some of these. Well, we know it's not an oat because it doesn't have the right characteristics. We know it's not big blue stem because it's not a large prairie grass that we would harvest for hay. And it just doesn't seem like it would be a long spine sandbur. So we can clearly see it's yellow nutsedge. Next one. All right. Is it soybean, alfalfa, Korean lespedeza, or prostrate spurge? This one might be a little tricky. One more. Any more takers? Just a wild guess. Well, we'll go ahead and call this one. This is Korean Lespedeza. A good job on that one. That one could have been a little tricky. I thought some of you might have gone for alfalfa, but none of you did. So good to see that. All right. Next one. Number 9. Is it triticale, barley, yellow nutsedge, or yellow foxtail? This one should be pretty easy. Yep, 100% correct on that one. That one's yellow foxtail. Let's see if we can get some more challenging ones here as we go along. All right, next one up. Is it soybean, common cockleburr, barnyard grass, or pinto field bean? Those are the options in front of you. 100% correct again. Man, you guys are just knocking it out of the park. Let's do this next one. All right, this one might be a little more tricky. Is it alfalfa, barnyard grass, triticale, or Pennsylvania smartweed? All right, we got all the responses in. Let's put the results out. The answer was barnyard grass. Now, why is that important to remember? Well, on the one hand, it looks kind of like some sort of seed that you might see cattle grazing on, or something you might see out in a pasture or a hay meadow. But it's not triticale because we know that triticale's got kind of a longer, more pill-shaped seed to it. So it's not a broadleaf weed, and it's not alfalfa, and it's not triticale. So it's got to be barnyard grass. All right, next one up. Here are your 4 options. Is it canola, shattercane, quackgrass, or pearl millet? Guys, got to use your skills of deduction. Okay, so we had a split on this one, but the answer was quackgrass. Canola is in the mustard family, which would be a brassica, but this here has a seed that resembles a grass. So that's something that we want to keep in mind whenever we're basically using process of elimination to get the answer to some of these. And of course, it wouldn't be shattercane or pearl millet because those would have much smaller and rounder seeds. So let's do the next one. This is another seed. Is it rye, green foxtail, grain sorghum, or quackgrass? You guys are doing very, very well. The answer is rye. So something to keep in mind with grain sorghum, because grain sorghum is in that broader sorghum tribe, it's going to have a more round shaped seed to it. Rye is one of the cereal grains, and it's going to have the longer pill shaped, fuller grain. Now, it's not quackgrass either, because quackgrass isn't a cereal grain. And so quackgrass wouldn't have the fuller seed that we see here in the picture. So good job on those of you who said rye. All right, we have two more questions for you. All right, here are your four options. Is it cheat, Korean lespedeza, Canada thistle, or curly dock? Must be some vigorous internal debate going on here. We've only got two responses in so far. Oh, there comes another one. Okay. Hey, you guys did a great job. 100%. That is cheat. And how do we know it's cheat? Well, for one, we can look at the seed and say, that looks kind of similar to some of the other grassy type plants that we've seen before. But it's also got one of these tendrils on it that we haven't seen before in any of the pictures yet. So we know it's some sort of grassy plant. So it can't be a thistle, and it can't be Korean lespedeza, and it can't be curly dock. So cheat is our last option standing. Good job on that one, guys. Okay, here is the last one. This one might be tricky. Is it common ragweed, shattercane, Johnson grass, or eastern black nightshade? Okay, so the answer was shattercane. One of you got that correct, but the rest of you said eastern black nightshade. Now, it's understandable why you might pick that because, well, the seed's black. I guess that would mean that it's eastern black nightshade, but not necessarily. Something to keep in mind is, and I know that this picture doesn't really do good justice to it, but something to keep in mind whenever you're looking at the actual specimens on the table is what's the size of the seed? And this is a really close-up picture, so you don't really get a good idea of the size of the seed. But shattercane is a weed that is notorious for bothering folks who have grain sorghum growing. And if you look at the seeds on shattercane, you'll see some similarities to what we'd see in grain sorghum. And so if you look at it that way, you might have been able to identify it as shattercane, but that's a tricky one. That's probably one that we would have on one of the higher divisions. But that's all that I have for uh, testing your knowledge questions. And I didn't keep score if anyone's asking, so I don't know who had the most right and who didn't. I see Matthew's upset with me about that. But that's all right. This was just for practice. The official day of this contest is coming up next Saturday, but Until then, does anyone have any questions?